Hey everybody, this is Jake Wynn, public historian, with Justin Voidhofer, also public historian, back here for another episode of our Masters of the Air recaps. This time talking about episode 8 of this World War II miniseries on Apple TV Plus. Justin, how are you doing this evening?
I am well. I'm well. We were excited to talk about the episode because it was not what I expected your results to be, which we're going to get into. So why don't you keep it going, Jake?
Yeah. So I have things surprisingly didn't hate this episode. So after watching, if you've watched last week's episode where I was like, hey, I'm not sure how this is gonna go. We'll get into that in just a little bit with our reactions. But let's talk about what we saw in this episode very quickly. Run through what we saw in episode 8. This is the episode where we meet the members of the 332nd Fighter Group of the 15th Air Force serving in Italy. These are the famed Red Tails, also known as the Tuskegee Airmen, so African American fighter pilots who break a lot of barriers during the course of their service in the Second World War. And in this episode, we see them get out of P-50 or P-40 aircraft, which I have to say are among my favorite fighter planes of the Second World War. So I love the P-40, but they jump into the plane I love most of all, the P-51. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but considered the one of the best fighter planes of the Second World War, and are issued later to the black servicemen than they are to their white counterparts. So that plays a part in this episode. We see Crosby, navigator back with the 8th at Thorpe Abbotts, preparing for D-Day and being a real hot mess and not sleeping, using a lot of amphetamines, which, by the way, they used a lot of in the Second World War on all sides. So this is a nice little like teaser to like, oh yes, they used a lot of drugs during the Second World War. We see Sandra, Crosby's love interest, serving in the British kind of Secret Service in Paris, doing secret things in the lead up to D-Day. We finally see D-Day take place with the 8th Air Force going and participating. Get a little Rosie Rosenthal recap of what he saw during the course of their service in the D-Day Normandy landings. And I think most importantly, and kind of like the name of the show, he talks about air supremacy, but they didn't see the Luftwaffe. The Germans didn't show up to ruin the D-Day landings, and that is in part, like we talked about last week in episode 7, it's kind of the goal of the 8th Air Force's strategy leading up to the Normandy invasions. We see some of those red tails get shot down while strafing radar stations for other landings, which they barely talk about, but just acknowledge very briefly. The landings in southern France in the summer of 1944. And we see the airmen that survive being shot down going through being captured and then going through German interrogation, which is where the Germans very interestingly, say ironically, poking at American discrimination and segregation, talking about what are you even really fighting for, talking about black neighborhoods back in the States. And then we get a really great scene of one of those airmen kind of snapping back and saying that America is trying, and that when he gets back, he's going to play a role in making that happen faster, of fighting for true equality in America. And then we go into Stalag Luft III, and we see a lot of things going on there, including the SS taking over. I see we have another character just added to the podcast, a guest star.
Yes. Everybody say hello to Hawkeye. Yeah, he's done. Sorry about that.
He's jumping in. And we see the kind of preparing for the end game at Stalag Luft III, of realizing the Buck and Bucky and all the other officers in this prison camp realizing that the end of the war is coming. They know that the landings have taken place, in part because of the reaction of the overseers of the camp. And then they realize that there's probably only a couple of ways that the end is going to come, and they're begin planning for those possible eventualities coming with the end of the conflict. And then also seeing some great scenes of kind of the acceptance of these black airmen coming into the camp, and kind of understanding that everybody is bringing some skill set to the table that can be useful during their internment, and preparing for the end of their internment. And then in the end, we finally see Crosby sleeping through the week of D-Day, getting a break and going home, and he is preparing for those for that trip back to the States, trying to end things, trying to go see Sandra, his love interest, but she has decided to break it off. Um, and so he's preparing for his trip home to the States. And then I'd say in the end of this episode, we are just preparing for the final episode, which we still have a lot of ground to cover in episode 9. So, but Justin, what did you think about this particular episode?
Yeah, so I wrote going into it, and what I was thinking about watching the episode is, man, we are jumping around a lot. We're going to North Africa, no, not North Africa. We're going to Sicily, the Italian campaign with Tuskegee Airmen. We're going back to Thorpe Abbotts. We're going to POW camp, and all points in between, kind of jumping around. But what I was happy with is for the first probably 3/4 or 75% of the episode was really wondering how they're going to tie everything together, and then with the African Americans being taken to Stalag Luft III, then I kind of enjoyed that meshing of the storylines. I only wish that it kind of happened a little bit more and we had some more character development with those folks. Jake mentioned the comment of the interrogation scene. It was kind of familiar from what Bucky went through, poking and prodding in different ways. And that line that the African American pilot has is really great, but I think the only downside is I just don't know that I didn't at that time. I can look back and I don't know what that person's name is. I don't know who to associate it with, and I think that's the only kind of negative comment I have on the episode. Is just the Tuskegee story felt a little rushed. We see them with their P-40s. We don't see them going to Germany in the P-51s during that first mission. We see them supporting Operation Dragoon. We see a lot of things about it, but I think the kind of fly through it. And then it kind of slows down once they're shot down and kind of go through the same ordeal that we've seen with Buck and Bucky. So I make the note in here. If the last episode was a bridge episode, I don't know what to call this one because it's another bridge episode. So it's a bridge to the bridge. It's a dual bridge. But like Jake said, there's going to be a lot that they need to kind of wrap up, and I'm confident they will. A lot that episode 9 is going to be. I mean, I'm expecting. I would think that when we hit play on the next episode and it shows you the timestamp at the bottom, it's probably going to be over an hour. I would hope it would be over an hour. Anything less than that, I think, is going to be very, very rushed here. But willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. We got there during this episode. But yeah, that's what my thoughts on it. Jake, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I think first reaction was that I didn't hate it like I thought I was going to. It does move very quickly, which has been a complaint of mine throughout a number of these episodes that bounce around a lot. We don't get to spend a lot of time with any individual characters. However, I thought that this episode was really well done. I really enjoyed the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. I think they did a good job of bringing them in, making them relevant to this story. Giving us an accurate representation, though short, an accurate representation of what these guys were going through, what they were fighting for, what they were fighting against in terms of American discrimination, and how they kind of had different strategies around that, how they were thinking about it differently. Some of those pilots taking on a more kind of, trying to make more things happen quicker. I'm trying to be more active about it. And others saying like, yeah, it's just like the weather. We can chart around the weather, but we can't change the weather, which I thought was an interesting comment talking about kind of American views on race in the 1940s from a Black perspective. That being said, wish we could spend more time with them. But I think in the short time that we see, I think they did a really good job. I also think this is an area that has gotten a lot of coverage in films and been multiple movie adaptations about the Tuskegee Airmen, some of which go very, very Hollywood and kind of over the top and leave the historical accuracy on the cutting room floor. I think this did a good job of accurately representing while still making it very interesting and then layering it into what up until this point has been a very white story. And I think that has been something going back to Band of Brothers is something that Tom Hanks talks about in the 20-year podcast, looking back at Band of Brothers and showing just like that was a very white story. And it didn't really try to loop anybody else in except for briefly seeing the Red Ball Express truck drivers driving them to the Battle of the Bulge. In this, they did a much more deliberate job of thinking about, these guys are here. They are a part of the story. Let's bring them in. And I really commend them. And I think they did it in a very, very smart way, and a way that adds a lot to this to Masters of the Air as a whole story. Um, I still have a lot of ground to cover in this in one episode, so I'm hoping, like you, Justin, for a long episode, almost feeling like an episode and a half to get through this for episode 9. Other comments, reactions. Love the P-51s. I'm glad we get to see some episodes focusing on the fighter pilots, which we don't see much. It's focusing mostly on the bomber boys in this episode, in this series, which makes sense with the subject matter of Masters of the Air. But man, I love the P-51s. I could watch them on screen all day, CGI, in real life, at an air show. Just love the Mustang. I think it is a beautiful plane, and widely accepted as the best fighter plane in the Second World War, and rightfully so. And then final thoughts. I really don't understand why we wasted screen time to see Sandra in Paris. I thought that was a kind of a waste of time, and I guess it was just trying to figure out a way of showing where she went, what she was doing. But I just kind of think it was kind of waste of time. There's that time could have been used more wisely. I don't think that they have let us care enough about her to give her the amount of screen time that she got in this episode. Even though we don't really see her doing anything, so um, it's a little bit of a frustration to me. But then I also would say that we saw a lot less D-Day than I thought we would see. We basically just see the one scene that we see in the trailer, which comes in one of the only flashbacks we get in this whole miniseries is Rosie talking about his experience on D-Day when the clouds cleared and he actually could see the beaches and the fleet. And I thought that was really well done, and kind of interesting that they didn't focus as much on that. I think I was thinking about that, but going back to Justin, what you mentioned in last week's recap, talking about how for the 8th Air Force, the D-Day landings and the invasion story really comes in the weeks leading up to it, where they're kind of the bait, getting the Luftwaffe to come up and fight and destroy them in the air in the lead up to it. So I guess that would make sense that we wouldn't see D-Day itself very much in this episode. So that's a lot. I have a lot of thoughts, but let's pivot to our next kind of section here. And Justin, I know you have some things you want to talk about, kind of the history behind this episode.
Well, yeah, I just pick up what you talked about with D-Day too. Yes, the D-Day scenes were not nearly as long, but I think that's a good thing. I think so much of the Second World War, so much of our World War II memory, we tie into D-Day, we tie into Normandy. You think about how many references. Oh, my grandfather fought in Normandy. They're not saying anything else. They're not saying it. My family didn't, but what I'm getting at is when people describe their grandfather or their grandmother's service or whatever, they always try to connect it to Normandy. And I think by doing that, you lose out on the incredible breadth of effort that went into winning the Second World War. And you kind of see that with the Tuskegee men there in Italy. Operation Dragoon that they talk about, the invasion of southern France, which goes off pretty well, not to be overlooked there either. There's a whole lot of Anglo-Allied debate into if that's necessary. They call off the second landings of that, but still, you have another operation besides D-Day that is going on in the summer of 1944, another amphibious landing, and that's where the Tuskegee, they play a big role in it. They're eliminating the radar sites. They're hitting Germany from a different angle there too. So I'm kind of excited, or not excited. I'm kind of glad that we didn't focus. We covered D-Day a lot with Band of Brothers. I think that is ground that is much already covered on top of Saving Private Ryan, all that kind of other things. So we didn't need the Storming the Beaches episode. We already have that and other things. So I'm glad Rosie's kind of account of it, because when you read the accounts of the veterans from the Second World War, that is one thing they talk about, is just the sheer magnitude of the invasion. They realize all these different things are coming together, all the ships that are there, everybody on the front lines, and everything that went into making the Allied invasion possible. The depth and breadth of it, I think, are just hard for us to even imagine, even with modern technology and CGI, like we said. Like that'd be, if I could drop myself in one thing during World War II and just to see the photo of what it looked like, it would definitely be what Rosie saw, flying over the beaches, flying over the landing craft. I think would have been really, really impactful and made you feel a part of something bigger, which is really cool. So With that though, we'll pivot to the Tuskegee boys. They they don't really talk about it here. I think they kind of allude to it, but they don't officially call during World War II. What's called the Double V campaign: victory abroad, victory at home. A lot of African Americans who go out and fight during World War II want to come back and make the United States better than what they left it. I mean, this is a United States that's still very heavily segregated. We're still 20 odd years away from the Civil Rights Act. We're still 20 years away from what goes on in the 1960s that we associate with African American experience during the 20th century here. So these guys are the ones that are going to come back and make those things possible, as he talked about during the episode. Once again, I keep referring to he. I wish I had a name to associate with it. I digress. So the Tuskegee men are in Italy, and I doing some research prior to the episode. I wanted to read part of Masters of the Air, which talks about this is something we should think about when we talk about World War II. Is it is still a segregated army? I think I mentioned it before. This army is not desegregated. That's not going to come around until Korea. So the army that fights and storms the beach at Normandy is still a segregated army, which shows, I think, the what he talked about. The United States is still working towards that bigger ideal that it wants to hold itself to. Even at our most proud moment, you can still see that there's some things that we're fighting for that are interesting and kind of to dive deeper in. But this is from Masters of the Air. This is Donald Miller writing. He says the Air Force had a long-standing policy of institutional racism. At the beginning of the war, Eleanor Roosevelt joined black leaders to pressure her husband to integrate the historically all-white Army Air Corps and to put black pilots into combat. Hap Arnold grudgingly established an all-black fighter unit, the famous Tuskegee Airmen, named for the Alabama base where they trained. These pursuit pilots served with distinction in the Mediterranean theater, but the Air Force drew the line on integrating bomber crews, insisting that blacks and whites, especially Southern whites, could never operate effectively as combat teams, nor would the 8th integrate its fighter command. Arnold feared that a policy of integration would result in Negro officers serving over white enlisted men. Thus, he said, would create an impossible social problem. So it's an interesting kind of thing of why we don't see the Tuskegee boys in England, why we don't see them except in Africa too. So I'm glad that they're in here. As Jake said, it is a very important part of World War II to think about. And I'm also glad that we didn't focus just on D-Day here. And then finally, POW experience. I can't even talk about if what we see is accurate because I've never seen it before. I've never really had the urge or the ability to see them kind of talk about this. And you talk about with the SS taking over the camp, what's going to happen to them at the end of the war. They don't know. They know the SS is pretty brutal. They know what they've done to other kind of groups. So you see Buck and Bucky, I think, trying to figure out we can't go down quietly. We're gonna try to get some agency into how we end this war and what we can do. And yeah, with the I don't know, with the Tuskegee guys showing up there once again, Jake, you might be able to speak to it. I don't know if that actually happened. If it did, I mean, I think you see kind of the relationship is still not the greatest between African Americans and some of the white kind of pilots in Stalag Luft III. Because I mean, the only reason they end up in Bucky's tent or cot or whatever or structure, I think, is because they kind of were denied other places. Other white officers and other white airmen did not want them in their bunks. So it's kind of an interesting experience. I wish we kind of get to the personal recollections of Buck and Bucky. I would love to dive into that and see how they feel about it. But once again, this is a limited series. We could spend forever talking about it. So yeah, I guess I'll give them the benefit of the doubt there. But Jake, anything else historical experience that I missed that you wanted to highlight? I'm sure I did somewhere.
No, I think you did. I think you did a great job. I think that's a point. Kind of going less about the history, more about the episode and the series itself. It's like that's something where because we're moving so quickly, that it's like, oh, I want to spend a little bit more time at the prison camp where they're initially coming in to like. I think that there's an opportunity from the filmmakers to kind of explore the differing reactions that the white airmen there from all over the country, as you hear from the Donald Miller account, how they would have reacted to those men coming in because they are Americans. They are fighting in the same conflict, but there's a whole swath of white Americans who view African Americans as being not worthy of being there, that they shouldn't be there, that they shouldn't be in fighting situations, they shouldn't be in combat. I think that that's something that we kind of breeze over. We don't get the full kind of range of feelings and emotions and full range of what that story would have been like. But I digress on my reactions to the filmmaker side of this. I think just I think there's a lot left to be said, a lot of stories left to be written about the experience of Black servicemen in England. I think during World War II, one of the areas I remember distinctly from reading the Rick Atkinson trilogy around the Second World War in the European, African, and Mediterranean theaters. And I think he talks about it in the last book, which is Guns That Last Light, talking about in England and then in France about the Black experience of combat soldiers, also support staff, which many of the African American soldiers and sailors are put into kind of service roles, just as they were back in the First World War. Not many segregated combat units. And talking about the experience, especially in England, of how for many Black Americans it was the first time that they tasted equality, where they went to a place where the residents of England did not treat them any differently. Segregation to them was a foreign concept, and they, for many English residents who had never been exposed to large numbers of Black people, they just viewed them as people. They didn't understand American segregation, and there's a lot of chafing that took place between American officers trying to bring over American segregation from the United States and glomming it onto England, and English people revolting against that and seeing it as inherently unfair as it was. I think that those complexities are just rich for a story to be told about that, to focus in specifically on that from some kind of, I don't know, television, a movie adaptation. I know that there is a Tyler Perry Netflix movie coming at some point in the future, called 6888, which focuses in on an African American women unit that worked at sorting and sending mail. They were a mail unit, so helping to sort and send out mail to servicemen and women all over the European theater. And that was a unit that served in England and in France. So it'll be interesting to see if that story is told as part of that narrative. So just kind of picking up something that you mentioned, Justin, there, and running with it. But I think you did a great job of tying in all the different kind of historical aspects of this episode. So good stuff. Good stuff. So do you have any closing thoughts as we race towards the end here?
I mean, we talked about it. The finale is going to be interesting. I mean, I'm excited to see us sitting down here next week. I truly am, because I think Jake would agree with me too. Overall, this has been fantastic, and this has been something that I think it will stand the test of time. This is something that I think will get people interested in World War II, get people interested in those complexities Jake just talked about. And I know we can sit here every episode and we kind of nitpick different things, but making something like this is hard. And there are people who are way smarter than us that are doing it. So we thank them for taking the time to do it. But I say all that to say I'm really excited to be here sitting next week. I hope it's good. I hope it's a long episode. I hope we tie everything in from the previews. I think we kind of do. So we're going to be jumping around a little bit, but yeah, I hope that they are able to tie it up in a way that does not feel rushed, and tie it up in the way that a story like this deserves. Which once again, I trust them to do it. They're smart people who make these things. So yeah, that's basically what I hope for this time next week. How about you, Jake?
Yeah, it's going to be a race to the finish. We got a lot to finish off, a lot of stories to tie off here. But it's going to be interesting to see how they do it. I'm very curious to see from kind of a writing perspective how they finish this up. And then because from a purely visual standpoint, this has been a feast. It's been amazing to watch. I think from the sets to the uniforms to the CGI, everything from that standpoint in the series has been flawless. I've been enjoying it thoroughly. I think despite the challenges of having to do so much with CGI, they did a really good job of making it feel real. Not too many moments that feel like a video game. And from that standpoint, I think they did a really great job. I think the prison camp too. We don't get to see too many like wide shots of the prison camp, but when you do, it's like, whoa, they really did a pretty amazing job of bringing one of those stalags to life. And I think that's one of the elements of the series that we're going to look back on as wow. I mean, from a visual standpoint, they made us feel like we were there, and that is incredibly hard to do with this subject matter. So, mad props to them for that. Um, but yeah, well, I'm very curious to see how I'm going to feel next week at this time when we're reviewing the last episode, because and then we'll start thinking about, where does this fit into, media about the Second World War? How is this landing in, 2024? What's the reaction to this? I know that lots of people have been watching it. And we'll see, how this shifts the conversations about the Second World War. Will this be looked at in years to come as another kind of band of brothers, something that people go back to and watch over and over again? Or is it going to be more of a blip and kind of forgotten? So it'll be very interesting to see kind of how this fits into the memory of the Second World War and other films and media adaptations, and how the perspective on this series on Masters of the Air kind of evolves in the years to come. But those are thoughts for the future. So, do you have any final thoughts, Justin, before we sign off here?
No, I think the only thing is to answer your question there. I hope it is, because I think that the people who play these roles are very, I don't know, I feel like their star trajectory is going to be this. So, when Austin Butler is 20 years from now winning his second Oscar or whatever it may be, we can look back and be like, ah, yes, that's Buck Clevin, or that is, Major Egan for Callum, what is his last name, Turner, whatever his name is. Anyway,
Yeah.
like Band of Brothers was for so many actors, it kind of gave them their break and gave them their stuff. So I think that's the other reason why we kind of look back on it fondly, as we remember everybody in them when they were younger, and including Jimmy Fallon. Hey, it's we don't have the Jimmy Fallon. I guess there's no, it would be the equivalent today of somebody like running through randomly on the episode. I don't even know. Yeah, Trevor Noah. I don't know. I have no idea who the person would be. That would just be the most random person to see in this thing. So.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in with us yet again. We have episode 9 will be coming next week. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you did enjoy, just hit that thumbs up button. You can subscribe for more content like this. We're going to continue doing these kind of conversations in some form or another moving forward into the future. So stay tuned for more information. If you want to know the latest on that, you can go over to my Facebook page, which is Jake Wynn Public Historian. You can follow us there. And you can stay up to date with the latest information and more about conversations with Justin and I about whatever's going on in the history world. So we're looking forward to continuing these discussions and bringing in more guests, and excited to tell you more about that as it develops. So thank you all so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week for the final episode of Masters of the Air.